Greetings, race community. Brent coming in live with Armin Afsahi, who is the Dean of Development and Associate Vice President of Alumni Affairs and Development for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Harvard University. How do you fit that on a business card? Dean Armin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Brent. Nice to see you.
We are 10 minutes into recording, but none of you get to hear the last 10 minutes because that was just our pre-recording chit chat. But it has brightened my mood, and Armin's smiling big, and we've been looking forward to catching up for a while now. So welcome, and how you feeling?
I'm feeling good. I am feeling excited, motivated, optimistic, hopeful, and on a variety of fronts. You know, societally, and the work that we do, and the lives that we lead. So it's a good day. It's a great day to be with you, Brent.
I'm glad to hear that. I feel the same way. And I have to just acknowledge to our audience, right? I have varying degrees of pre-existing relationships with our guests. Sometimes I'm meeting people for the first time by way of the podcast. Sometimes it's, somebody that I've known for a long time. That is the case today. But I will have to say, if I had a spectrum, if there were a spectrum of people who I know the best, like the most, and have done the least amount of business with, there is one guy on the very far end of that spectrum, and that is Armin. So just wanted to acknowledge that to set a little bit of context. As well as I feel like I've gotten to know Armin, one of the great things about the podcast is we oftentimes, in any of our professional relationships, our relationship is sort of formed at a moment in time, and then we get to know each other from that point forward. One of the fun things about the podcast is it's really been a catalyst to get to know you and other guests before we connected on the case circuit or at some conference along the way. And so I really have been looking forward to that, because as much as I feel like we have a great rapport and relationship, I really don't know that much about the beginning of your journey. And one of my favorite questions for my podcast guests has really been just learning more about your own journey to higher education. So many of us are in the sector because higher education has had a big impact on our lives, so much so that we've decided to dedicate our careers to that, to this sector. And so I have to ask you, going back to let's call it the mid 80s, junior year of high school. Who was that Armin? What was he into? And what led him to the UC San Diego campus?
Wow. Middle of the 80s, you're going that far back. This is it's going to be one of those contemplative sessions.
Hey, it's your LinkedIn profile, all right? I'm just letting it guide me.
Yeah, it's actually, I'll make it very brief, but I think it is a highly interconnected journey for me, because I of course I grew up in San Diego. I wanted to be an astronaut, and in fact my 8th grade career wasn't a career center, but I forget what the office is in a junior high, but we take that assessment and it tells you the 3 careers that you're destined to assume or undertake, and my top one was astronaut, and I was so excited that I was going to be an astronaut. I fully believed that was going to be my path. I graduated high school in 85. Traveling outside of the city was not really financially in the cards for our family at that point. We were political refugees, came to the US, and my parents had to rebuild our lives. And
where did your parents come from?
From Iran. So we left during the revolution, and we're fortunate to have a safe haven in the United States, and of course extremely fortunate that my older brother was studying in San Diego, so that was the destination for us. But I chose to attend the University of California, San Diego, and loved my experience there. It really awakened my sense of curiosity and discovery. I was first pre-med, but then fell in love with social sciences and study of culture and values and human history, and everything from anthropology to media. And that, graduated in 1990. And for me, it was, if some of the more mature listeners would relate, that was a really interesting time in our country. That was the first Iraq War. And so, it was a tough employment market. And I chose to take an administrative job at my alma mater in the academic and research enterprise side of campus, which then, grew over the 7.5 years in that part of my journey there to really work in a pretty important role, advising the vice chancellor for research and then working in the School of Medicine, all around the academy, the scholarly enterprise, and working with faculty and scientists. It was fascinating to me to really understand.
We have very few members of the podcast roster who have worked in that side of the house. And so when you think about research and just the academy, what are one or two things that, having spent that much time on the inside, that are probably not appreciated by the typical advancement professional who, has some exposure by the nature of the work, but hasn't been on the inside and might not have that level of empathy?
Yeah, great question. I mean, aside from really gaining a deep respect and appreciation for the academy, which for me, that was really formative and has been a consistent guide in my work in advancement. But I said the two things is, one is really understanding the dynamics, the incentives, the rewards of a faculty within an academic environment. And because I work very closely with them, and that's something that you don't see as a student. And I think some of us probably in development, alumni relations, or other areas of advancement, we may experience, but that was a firsthand look and engagement in how they conduct their work, what drives and motivates them, what's really at the heart of the dynamics that they create with graduate and undergraduate students, and then their own networks and global associations. And then secondly, it's when they become administrators, those faculty who become department chairs and deans and vice chancellors and presidents. And I've had really the privilege of working with some amazing academic administrators, both in my current part of my career, but back then. And that's another very rich area of exposure to how are they guided? How do their academic disciplines shape their administrative and management acumen? And how different are they from private sector executives? And so just having those two live side by side in my formative experiences, I think has been truly profound.
And when you're in that role, inevitably you had some intersection with advancement or alumni engagement. I'm sure, it's just a part of the university structure, but from where you sat then, like, what was the word on the street about the folks over there in advancement? Or like, what was the kind of dynamic between the faculty or the deans and so forth from their vantage point, looking over at the advancement operation, if you recall?
Yeah, I think if my answer probably would be different than others who've had similar experiences at other institutions. This is UC San Diego, probably at age 30. It's still a relatively young university who has really achieved remarkable success on multiple fronts. It's nearly a $5 billion enterprise today, one of the top public universities. But back then it was relatively small. So proportionally, the advancement function was pretty small. And so I didn't know anything about it. I learned about the Alumni Association when I received the Outstanding Senior Award and went to the gala with my parents. And then I got involved as a volunteer. And that's where my journey as a volunteer was cultivated, was fully post experience. But I never recall conversations being direct or indirectly associated in those days of my professional years around development and the academic enterprise.
And after that initial role, you took a right turn into the commercial sector. And maybe that's why you've always been so nice to me and other folks out there on the conference circuit, because you've been in a business development sort of, it sounds like sales and marketing type capacity, but I don't recall us really talking about that. And so I'm curious sort of what the catalyst was to move into the kind of commercial side of the still education world, is my understanding, and kind of what some of your reflections were from that time.
Yeah. First of all, I'm nice to you, one, because I like you, two, because I have enormous respect for the way you lead and just who you are. So that's the experience you get from me. I hope consistently.
I was really just setting you up to say that. So thank you so much. That's great.
I read my briefing, so that's good. No, I was invited to join a startup with a group of alums, which then that was a right turn, and then that parlayed into a second startup. They were successful, one somewhat successful, the other was more of an experiment, and but they taught me so much about this thing that we talk a lot about now, which is fail fast and acceleration, agility, the terms that is often used now in our leadership and management vernacular. It's like I experienced those firsthand with startups that attracted a significant amount of venture capital, had to go to market, had to sell and position services and products. All, by the way, both of them were centered around technology or advancing access to education.
And just to set some context, this was essentially like peak.com period, at least initial, right?
Peak.com. So when I go to Case and I go into the marketplace, I mean, we went to every conference and exhibited, and I would be with the sales team, either part of or leading it, or the business development team, and just hustling to sell an idea, to sell the nucleus of idea, to bring early adopters to test our platform. And so, when I first came to your office in Boston, I think you've sensed it. I had this envy that I want that environment back, and I respect you because you've just have built such an incredible organization. But I think that's my 5 years or so, and then some of the work I did around the consulting side of it was, I think, just really has been helpful to me, because I can appreciate how to integrate pace, risk taking, and an acceleration of ideas into an environment and a profession that I think it's just like the rest of the educational marketplace. So
yeah, I mean, look, it's we often, right, our whole thing has been, how do we help the world of advancement operate more like a well-oiled marketing, sales, and customer success machine? That's it. And some people hear that and it turns them off, because then it sounds like you're saying fundraising is sales and all these things. The point is, like, the process to define a market, segment a market, prioritize who you're going to engage with limited resources, and go generate revenue is very, very similar. That is what the best advancement organizations do. The difference is, when you were at EduPoint or Learning Framework Inc., or when I started EverTrue, unlike Harvard or UC San Diego, where there is a built-in community of natural prospects with deep affinity and appreciation for the mission and the institution, who've already done business with you as students, when you're that guy at the conference circuit in those early years, there is zero.
You wish you had predisposition,
and so that's where we look at it, and we just continue to be, on one hand, blown away by the 50 billion plus a year that is brought in by you and your colleagues to help create access and opportunity for families like yours and mine, while also being wildly optimistic about how much revenue is being left on the table in the absence of the pace and the systems and the approach that we're going to continue to champion until my time on this planet is finished, or we solve the problem. Hopefully the latter.
Yeah. No, invigorate what I hear, because I know we've talked about this very thing and the thrust of what you're expressing, and I fully believe that, because I think we create, if you think about it in the private sector language that you were just using, this lead generation, lead management qualification, for us, it's already baked into what we what we see in our alumni, and it's often parent communities. But there's two sides to look at this, Brent. One is, say, the side that I think should keep us very hungry and motivated and focused, and with partnerships with companies like yourselves to be innovative, which is, despite all of that higher education graduates these incredible individuals and we raise so much money. I think most places, and I think the national data, I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, is a very it's not over 50% that participate annually. In fact, it's declining sharply every year. The publics are 10 and below. There's some outliers like Princeton and UVA and some of the Ivies and privates. But to think that we can't make a convincing case to our alumni that we're worth $1 or an hour of their life every year, like, that's crushing. I always say that to everyone I agree. That should be motivating to us. The flip side of this is where my optimism kicks in and keeps me in check, is that I like to think, and in fact, when I actually talk to as many graduates of American colleges and universities, something about the experiences that our over 4,000 colleges and universities create, we should be also quite grateful that likely many of them are the ones contributing to the thousands of nonprofits and NGOs around the world. So we do cultivate the spirit of generosity. So one is, on one side is like, how much of that do we bring back into our own universities? The other is, how can we actually celebrate the spirit that it continues to grow, maybe consequent of access to education. So that's an interesting thing that I just, to me, keeps my eagerness in check to some extent.
Look, I think that you're spot on. I mean, there's another way to, if you think about giving as part of this alumni life cycle, right? I mean, what is the life cycle? You learn about an institution, you apply, you attend, right? You have your experience, you graduate. And behind the scenes, what are we doing? We're transferring data from like an admissions CRM to an SIS, and then from an SIS to an advancement thing. And there's sort of this like data thing happening behind the scenes. But really, like, what we need to be able to convince people to do is to go from being a constituent who's paying financial aid adjusted, whatever, $10,000 a year or $25,000 a year or $50,000 or $80,000 a year, to a graduate who will contribute $100 a year. It's like, how do we go from 80,000 and earn like 100 the next year? And and make it less of a hard stop from one to the other. And I think the other issue is just the reality is, when you map this sector to the commercial sector, and we see this in our data all the time, and I'm sure Harvard is a clear example of this. In the commercial sector, somebody would say, how many good leads do we have? Let's come up with some ratio. And we'll say, for every great lead we have, for every 1,000 great leads, we'll hire one salesperson. I'm just making it up. Because that's what the model suggests would support a profitable return on that new sales representative. If you applied that to many leading higher ed institutions, you literally might have a number that suggests 5x or 10x the number of frontline development staff than we currently have today. Mm-hmm. And there aren't a lot of other sectors where you sort of, I don't know, structurally or however we get here, you sort of intentionally leave that many relationships down in the middle to bottom of the giving pyramid, where any sort of commercial organization would say, are you kidding me? We've got that many amazing leads that aren't being managed today. Like, staff up, let's go.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think there's, I think this is where there's really some, continues to be. And I think I'm really anxious to see the moment where we see a greater number of solution providers and partners. But I think what you're touching on, Brent, is how can we scale this operation to meet the opportunities that it is presented with? And I don't think our current formulas and structural paradigms in development, alumni relations, or the leaders or the institutional cultures creates a conducive environment to think in terms of scalability. I mean, a lot of us have worked on campaigns, and it's like whether it's the cost per dollar that drives budget decisions or ambitions, or how much can we draw down from the endowment, or what funding models can we create to fund the campaign. That's not often the way the other sectors think about opportunity. So I think it's, for me, like the way I tend to organize my thoughts around this very topic is, how do we partner to really scale the work that we do? Because there is some personalization, if I would, in the context of higher education and the operating paradigms within our world. That's a bit dissimilar to the private sector, but we have not figured out how to scale the organization. I think Adam and others tried through AI, or are trying through those things. But I think that's where the one pathway exists.
No doubt. And how we might do that, Armin, is radically different in mid 2022 than it would have been in January of 2020. Exactly. And you think about the fact that, when I go look at the Harvard alumni population and, think about the distribution of that community geographically, for example, every single one of those people is now a Zoom link away. They're a Zoom link away from a more authentic conversation than they've probably ever had with somebody at Harvard University, but certainly maybe less ideal than being able to fly out and get together in person and have some of those kind of unstructured moments we were talking about before we kicked off. And I do think this sort of incredible forced adoption of technology from the youngest to the oldest in a 2-year period is just starting to be realized. But it's tough because we also are feeling our pressure to get back on the road and to start doing the events again, and we could have reunion again, and some of those things that are sort of inherently less scalable but highly personal. How do we make sure we don't lose this moment to do these things that are now far more personal than we would have been able to do in the past, even if they're not the tried and true engagement models?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And you and I are getting together. I mean, we're going to be at the Case Summit this weekend, for example. And so, first time in a while that I think a lot of people will be able to get together in person, but we're going to continue to lean into, in our world, right, digital opportunities like the podcast, to engage. Now, if you're listening at this point and you're thinking, wow, these guys are talking a lot about sales and revenue, and these are some cold-blooded killers out there in the development game, I need to pay Armin some respects, because he came up in a really engagement-centric, community-centric way, and I actually love that about your career path, and I suspect that it gives you great empathy for many of the different kind of colleagues that you'd work with across the advancement enterprise. But I'd love to get some of the highlights when you had that opportunity to take that associate vice chancellor role at UC San Diego, leading this kind of advancement enterprise, connecting engagement and career and annual giving in a way that maybe certainly had not been done there before. I'd just love some of your reflections on that experience, and I know there are probably some shout outs to folks along the way that you might want to provide.
Absolutely. No, I think I've been part of teams, whether I joined a team or I built a team with others, but it's been some of the fondest memories I have, and I think some of the times of my career that I think we started to do some really special things that I know that have since been modeled, which is just really fills the heart. That there were merits enough for others to want to consider doing that. I one shout out I give is to Jim Langley, who was the person that really invited me to the world of advancement. I served on the alumni board and met him when he became our vice chancellor, and Jim and I just had a special relationship. But he's the one that just kind of wanted me to bring this perspective that you and I started in the early part of our conversation. And he was a risk taker, because then it was risky and it was, it was tough for me to be brought into a development world with someone who didn't work in the phonathon and then annual giving and, major gifts and so forth. But I think, at UC San Diego, one of the things when I came back from Jim went to Georgetown, I joined him. That's where we crafted and launched the Discovery Initiative, which became a national model for, I think, over 100 universities that adopted some version of the student discovery program. I love the days where we're blueprinting it with Matthew Lambert.
Yeah, I was going to say, so Lambert was there. Sean Scoville must have been there at some point.
Sean had left, but Jim
was
had
Mike still there or no?
No, Mike and Sean had left.
Okay.
And then Jim came in as VP, but Matthew was back then. I mean, Matthew's like, he's like also on one of my highest pedestals. But Matthew was like an assistant director. I don't know. He's just this like incredibly talented young professional. And when Jim and I thought about this idea, it's like, who could we give this to? Who knows our students and works with the senior class gift? And you kind of give a half an idea to an incredibly talented human being and support that person. I mean, this has been a recurring theme in my career, is whether it's been afforded to me or I've had the privilege of being part of affording it to others. It's like when you unleash talent, magic happens. And that was a discovery thing. San Diego.
So on that, I've heard Matthew's kind of perspective on that. But many of our listeners maybe didn't catch that episode yet. What is that discovery model? Like, what was the concept, and sort of why do you think back on that so fondly?
Because it really is, when I think it was even in San Diego when Jim and I often talked about how do we bring something unique and scalable to the world of development. And it was the untapped potential of our undergraduates. That's where the idea was being developed. And then so it's like, can we create a team, a development team, and what could it look like? And that was the seed of the idea for the Alumni Discovery Initiative. And generally it was get your best student ambassadors and give them a portfolio, hook or crook, create a CRM, which we did, get a good manager, Matthew, and fund it, give them a stipend per interview, train them, teach them, motivate them, and then let them go to their hometowns when they're back home, or just when they're in town, have them do 1, 2, and depending on how much money they want to make, some of them did 10 interviews a week. And so we just created that. I mean,
where is the post-COVID digital version of that? Like, this needs to come back with a new.
One, it's not a difficult business unit to launch. 2, it's high risk, low risk, high reward. Secondly, I mean, then in San Diego, we've all evolved this to some, because it has to take the personality, culture of the place. But it's often been an assistant director or program manager. I'm talking about the level of investment you make at an FTE level, and then inspire them to lead this program. And wherever we've done this and other places that have done it, they've seen this magic happen. And I think it's like, so it's low risk, high reward, easy to launch. You engage students and you get a lot of leads, like highly qualified leads. Because believe it or not, your alumni are far more willing to share their life stories and their passions and their ambitions and expectations and criticism and etc. with the student. And then what I learned from that experience was, this is probably the best way to foster a network and really create deeply beneficial, mutually beneficial relationships between alumni and students. I mean, the Discovery Initiative was the first building block that gave me the idea of integration of career services into advancement.
I want to talk about that, but just to double click on the discovery piece, I think especially at a time when call centers are being, shut down and people are looking for that new approach. And you talked about it earlier. How do we really scalably engage people in a personalized way, this sort of student discovery 2.0 feels like it is yet to be really cracked in a post kind of pandemic environment. And so, might want to pick your brain on that here in the coming weeks and months, because there's something there.
We should. And I think even then, this is what, 2005, I think, when we launched it back then. And then since then, it's just, as I said, it's been different versions. But even then, we were so surprised and just pleasantly surprised when students taught us how to do better research. I think in that is where like the idea for LinkedIn integration came to me.
Right.
At San Diego. We're the first.
But they're like, yeah, we used Google. You should check it out. It's really useful.
We're like, no, you have to wait 12 days for the research request to be submitted. And then somebody then does a research report, and then a manager has to approve it. And they're sitting there, I want to make my $30 an interview. So how do I like rapidly get some intel on this person? So there's something about the human ingenuity and in this generation, and they know the institution. Anyways, I
love it. Yeah, it's like, how do we, they'll help us work TikTok into the strategy one way or another, for sure. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about career, because, you've definitely been at the forefront. I'd say one of the pioneers, without a doubt, at really looking at the intersection of career service, career development and alumni relations and advancement more broadly. Historically, I lived it at Brown. It was like, career services in this tiny little office over here, frankly, limited resources relative to how important, that function is. And then sort of, in the beautiful buildings over there is where, the alumni team was. And there are some folks, I'm sure, who have pushed back over the years on, we're not a jobs machine. And we've heard that sort of narrative. I think that narrative is quickly going away because the market is speaking as it relates to what people want. But what was your journey? What inspired you to start thinking about that intersection? And then what, lessons did you learn? Or, when you reflect on it, what are you most proud of?
Yeah, I think it was really, I think the idea really came from, we did a lot of work in San Diego to just really learn from model institutions. We visited some of the Ivies and some of the privates and publics around the country when the chancellor then asked me to take on this role, because we were just, our alumni relations and even alumni giving in San Diego was terrifyingly low, again, and opportunities and potential very high. So after doing a lot of work on the alumni relations side and building that program and building the staffing and some innovations that we brought into just the alumni relations program, next step was to bring in the annual giving operation. We're one of the, I think, first public universities that fully brought in annual giving out of the development team into the alumni relations team. And primarily not because of anything other than it could change our narrative engine, and it could, by conjoining the two, and it could create more of a transparent relationship to our community. And we had enormous success. I think it's documented. The third piece of that was, okay, we got into then value proposition analysis. Like, we have sort of the structural things that are working towards, but what is ultimately the value proposition that we need to extend to our graduates that gives them confidence and hope? Those two things together, confidence and hope, that their affiliation with their alma mater is an investment worth making. And the question that emerged out of that inquiry was, let's force ourselves to ask one question and force ourselves to have one answer. Now, in a university, you never can do that, right? It's 1,000 questions, 1,000 blooming fields. But we forced ourselves to think of it that way. And it's like, why do people come here? To have a better life and get a job. It's like, if you just narrow focus it to that and make that your value proposition, what's missing in our portfolio? And it was this great disconnect with the entity that it is the expectation that you're going to help me get a job is really failing at doing so. So it got me really intrigued. And I traveled around the country. This was my other tour. Went around the country and talked to career services directors. And I went to a lot of I won't say I went to Harvard, but I went to a lot of other, institutions, probably like 15 or so. And I heard consistently that our job it's not about placement. And I said, but that's what the market is saying. It's like they come to this building because they ultimately are looking for your guidance to help them get a job. And that disconnect for me was really daunting. And I'm not saying maybe they have very good reasons why they believe that. And I think that national associations really hold that line. It's that career services is not about placement. I firmly believe it is. I think it is like, if you believe that's what your obligation is as an operating unit, then you will then organize yourselves to achieve that objective.
And, quick litmus test. If your enrollment marketing materials are sharing job placement stats.
Precisely. And
then you're telling people that that's not our job, that is not exactly consistent for sure.
By the way, I interviewed a lot of alums, and we did a survey with great returns that what is, of all the things, what's the greatest expectation and the biggest failure? We had a great partner who designed that instrument, and it was about jobs, career development, and access to a network. So I was fortunate that we're getting a new chancellor. So I went and made a pitch that we should really, and I knew the career services folks well because I was a student there, and actually was a positive example because they helped me get my first job. But and the chancellor and I came up with this idea of a vertical integration, alumni development, annual giving, and career services, vertically aligning and integrating those entities all under one unit. And that's, I think, the new trend that I'm so excited to see. So we took that to DU and other places.
Look, I think first of all, starting with market sentiment, getting the survey, I know that your peers have found similar, probably modeling off of your work. They've, hey, guess what? This is an area where we're probably over-promising and under-delivering. And you look at, enrollment marketing materials at any school, and nobody's shying away from that being a part of the why. And then how do you actually deliver? And then what is the perspective of your constituents? And sometimes people are afraid to do surveys like that because it reveals clear weaknesses. But what I love about that model is that you took career services, which in my experience, not a lot, but in my experience, working with career services leaders is so hamstrung because it is viewed as a cost center of the institution.
Absolutely.
And you took it and you made it part of a revenue center. And then you recognize that if one of the primary drivers of satisfaction or dissatisfaction is career support, and you want to create a healthy, strong environment for growing donor lifetime value, which is going to be rooted in satisfaction and gratitude, then you got to take some accountability for placement. And that will compound in the short term by way of participation, and the long term by way of planned gifts that otherwise never would have materialized.
Absolutely. Well said. And I think I won't say that in the two times that I've done this re-engineering, I won't say it's been easy, because you also really have to be mindful. And I know Matthew Lambert is now doing this at William and Mary. I'm aware of multiple other universities that have undertaken this thing. I think the recognition that the change management side of this, because you've got career counselors that are really part of the student advising culture of a university. And what we did gradually is either reshape their jobs and help them see themselves as placement officers. So career coaches and placement officers. And then the advisory role shifts back to the college advisor. So there's some very important considerations, and that's part of that. Is the organization ready for this? Is the culture going to be embracing of this type of change? Those are fundamental, and I wouldn't say simple things to engineer and to facilitate as part of something like this. But
so you had the opportunity to architect that change and be a part of what was a real growth story at your alma mater. And then you had the opportunity to really try to take that playbook and apply it in that vice chancellor role at the University of Denver, which was very much another growth story. And so in a couple minutes, just what are some of your reflections on that experience that you reflect on most positively?
Yeah, I mean, it was so exciting, and it was probably one of the hardest things to walk away from my San Diego role, because we were just humming, and we took a team of 6, and by the time I left, I think we're at 140 member team that really did development and scholarship fundraising and career development, alumni relations. It was just the value chain that we created was so magical, and I think the results, and even when I look today at the trustees on the foundation and the biggest donors, they're all coming from the community that we cultivated. It's like, that's what makes me love the work that we do, is that we see the connectiveness to these intentional strategies and designs. Anyway, Denver, when I went there, was part of my, it was really part of my negotiations that I would be interested in this job if at the beginning of my tenure, that the chancellor would have the career services be part of advancement. So she had the wisdom and the thrill and the openness. So that's how we entered. But I couldn't do it if I was not able to do all I could to recruit Brandon Busby because I hired him in San Diego. He helped build the enterprise and the industry element of it. And then having Brandon just join me at Denver. And then he came in as an associate vice chancellor and just helped build this incredible thing. We funded this amazing building now that houses all of it. It's magic.
I earlier said you had the opportunity to architect the strategy at UC San Diego, but you actually sort of got to be an architect as it related to the physical footprint at UD, which sounded amazing, or DU, which sounded amazing.
It was pretty fun. I mean, I always said, like, whatever this building is, it needs to have something that shines a light as a beacon of hope for the students. So when they walk around it, they know that this place will introduce me to amazing people, will cultivate my skills, and will enable me to have my internship and my first job. And I will forever remember that. And so Mark Rogers and Brandon and those who, after I left, they've created the space. Like when you look at the photos, the back stairway is like this lit beacon. So it's like, you gotta, I mean, this is the poetry of the experience. But kudos to Brandon and to the team who, have taken that and just done marvelous things with it. We're almost at time. We haven't spoken about Harvard at all. This is
so let's talk about Harvard, because I will admit that I was both thrilled when you shared that news that you were joining Harvard, and a little bit surprised. West Coast guy, kind of generally over there, Mountain Pacific, a little bit of a stint in DC, but what inspired you to take the role at Harvard and help us understand the scope? I commented on the expansive job title up front, but there are different lanes that you're operating in. How's it going? Sort of what's the reflection a couple years in now?
Yeah. Well, after I grew up as a San Diego Chargers fan, and after being crushed by the Patriots several times in the playoffs, and I just realized, like, I could actually trade the Padres for the Red Sox and the Chargers for the Patriots and see the 4 seasons. And so that was part of that. It was like just being in this ecosystem in the Northeast and in the Boston, Cambridge with these incredible institutions. I can't tell you how awake I feel. Every day I wherever you go, you're just surrounded by curiosity and hunger and hope, and it's just Boston and Cambridge is it's amazing. It reminds me of UCSD in the 80s and 90s, where it was really trying to define itself, but it's well defined in the history of the place. I just would give a lot of credit to Brian Lee, who has served as the chairman of CASE and vice president at Tufts and Caltech, and then came here. I've had a long association with Brian. I have incredible respect for him. I mean, his career and his professional contributions is documented. What people don't know often about Brian is what an amazing human being he is, how centered he is, how much love he has for the work he does, and the way he cares for the teams he cultivates. I always wanted to work with Brian, so that was a draw. And then, of course, Dean Gay, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, probably one of the most incredible and principled leaders, and Larry Bacow is our president. So those are the reasons. And then serving Harvard, who really engages in the everyday and most consequential set of things, and being part of this community is just an honor. And so truly for me was, of course, the Patriots and the Red Sox, and now the Bruins, but really the opportunity to be here at Harvard at this point is a true privilege for me.
You are entrepreneurial, and you have worked in entrepreneurial startups. You have worked in entrepreneurial settings, in growth settings, in higher ed. And I actually think Harvard is far more entrepreneurial than it maybe gets credit for, given how just storied the history is. But there is probably a limit to the sort of change that maybe can be tolerated, just given how successful the advancement enterprise has been. And so I'm just curious to kind of get your perspective on how do you calibrate the inherent entrepreneurial nature of your work in a more mature environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of ways to answer it, but maybe I will ground it in something that I hear a lot. I heard a lot, and I often hear from whether it's the president or the dean of the college. But just it's worth knowing that Harvard is going to be, in 2036, Harvard will be 400 years old as an institution. It was here before many things were actually in place on this part of the continent. We've been through civil wars and world wars and such. So it has been that entrepreneurial spirit of Harvard and its commitment to principles and values, and that has enabled it to continue to evolve, strengthen, achieve the remarkable and extraordinary excellence it has today. So I think thinking that just because it's mature and large and complex, I credit entrepreneurialism as a spirit of, to its journey. And I see it every day in my colleagues. I think there's we have an enormous responsibility to be responsive and to change and to examine our structures financially, residentially, academically, our relationship with the community. Where I think it's more challenging is that I think maybe where you may be coming from is does it do business more entrepreneurially? I don't know if that's what you're asking, but as an institution, I would posit that it is absolutely entrepreneurial, and its leaders every day think about ways that they can that we can best represent ourselves.
I mean, look, my experience was largely through my time at the business school. I was there from 2008 to 2010 when I think there was probably this moment where it's, on one hand, financial crisis. On the other hand, there was the backdrop of just Facebook and Google and LinkedIn and sort of the explosion of tech that was largely rooted in the West Coast. And there was a little bit of a catch up, and like seeing how quickly, once they decided we want to be world-class in entrepreneurship, and we want to do that in a way that is not just siloed in one college, right? That was when the Harvard Innovation Lab was basically created. And it was just like overnight, it just kind of solidified this, strength of entrepreneurship that did not necessarily have like a clear home around, campus. And so that was like just one example where it just seemed like it happened really, really fast, even though the reputation might be, well, higher ed slow or whatever it may be. I did not experience that.
Yeah, good.
Well, we were commenting earlier about how we are just locked on our Zoom blocks here, and our time is expiring. I just want to say thank you. You're such a positive, inspiring, optimistic person that's channeled throughout this conversation, and it's just great to see you again. I look forward to catching up in Chicago. But last opportunity, shout outs to your team. Are you hiring? And if people want to stay in touch with you or get in touch, what's the best way to do that?
Best way, I think I'm easy to find, but it's Armin_Afsahi at harvard.edu. I will just, we are hiring like everyone else, and it's a really exciting time in our industry in terms of talent and our obligation to build a more diverse and inclusive community. So if you're interested, if you're a risk taker, if you're a hope seeker, if your heart is always needs to be filled with joy and the abundance of opportunity and optimism, come talk to me. That's the
I might apply. That sounds pretty good.
I heard Warren Buffett once said, this is years ago, that always work at a place where you go to work singing every day. When your song stops, it's time to rethink. I sing to work every day, and I'm looking forward to meeting other storytellers and songwriters and singers. So these are really important times, and the more we attract people to this profession, I think the better the world will be, because what we do is noble and it matters. And so that's what I like to say at the closing, and to say thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Armin. Inspiring thoughts to close on. I'm going to go write a song. I hope everybody does the same.
You do write songs.
And with that, Brent, signing off with today's guest, Armin Afsahi, Dean Armin from Harvard University. Take care, everybody.